Hello everyone, welcome back to the second class or lecture of political science. In the first lecture, as you would remember, we defined what politics is, when was it defined, when did this thing started, and we gave more additional definitions for politics, political science. Does it try to study? What is its focus on? How it does it? What are the different explanations for it? And what are the tools, the concepts that the political science uses, right? And as I told you, the crucial concepts that in politics is, in the last lecture, is one of them was sovereignty and the other one was power. And we did spend a quite good time on power, how it's defined, why it's defined the way it is, and why we have two different definitions given by Dahl and Stephen Lukes for power and how they are different. So please do review those concepts, power and sovereignty, if you want to make the full value out of the second lecture as well. So in the second lecture, we continue to explore our concepts in political science, because these are the building blocks of this topic, of this study of politics. And because the concepts, the basic terms, terminologies, the building blocks, you cannot really get involved with political science without getting the concepts. That's why we are going over the concepts and trying to understand who gets what when, as we said in the last lecture, right? So here are more concepts for you. And nation states, I'm sure most of you have heard about this. Nation state. I was referring to this nation state in the last lecture. So it's now time, in the first lecture, now it's time to go over them. As you remember, I emphasized 2 or 3 times that state is the only one of the actors that enjoys the privilege of sovereignty. Yes? And I also said that power is so central to politics, political science. And the class, the first lecture, also started with saying how polis was the self-governing unit back in 500 BC in ancient Greece. But I said today we live in a very different world where we exist, the political units are organized as what we call nation states. Back then, the ancient Greece were organized around polis, the city-states. Athens was a city-state with its own army, with its own territory and control. It was like a country by itself, like America, as I told you, although very small and not 200, 300 million people, of course. And we had Sparta, we had other city-states that were scattered all around the Greece. Greece wasn't as one big united Greece as you see it today, like a nation state. Today it's a nation state. Athens is the capital. Athens is one of the cities of the Greek nation state that exists today. Same in France, same in Germany. We have a lot of cities, but they are all underneath what we call Germany. And I also told you that city-state, and we used to have empires throughout the centuries in human history. Now we don't have empires, we have nation-states. We have United Nations. Right? Even the definition of United Nations means that we have different nations that come together to resolve the world's matters. Whether they do resolve it or not is, of course, a different debate, and it's open to debate, but we need to realize that the nation state is the order of today's world. And it wasn't for so many centuries. Nation state is a new phenomena, that it started with 1789, especially with the French Revolution of 1789. That's when we started to have a nationalism, a nation-state building process in Europe, and then it spread all around the world. Okay, so that's why we don't have any more city-states. We don't have empires running around as we used to have. We have nation-states which exercise sovereignty in its own territory. So, well, nation-state, as you can see, is a combination of a nation and state. Well, why we call them nation-state? Why we have this term a nation-state? We will go this in more detail, definitely. But let's break them down. Nation and state. Nation. What is a nation? Of course, you have a nationality. Those who are listening to me my lecture, I have a nationality, and everyone has a nationality. That's how the world is designed now. That's the way the world runs today. Nation, made up of a distinct group of people who share a common background, including any or all of the following: geographic location, history, racial or ethnic characteristics, religion, language, culture, and belief in common political ideas. That's a very broad definition of a nation, definitely. But then when we say nation, we talk about Germans. Who are Germans? Americans, French, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Russians. They are all signify a nationality, and they all try to point out that when you say that he's a German, he's a French, he is a part of a bigger group of German nation or French nation. So that's how the identities today are defined. They are mostly defined through the individuals belonging to a certain nation, all right? And of course, that also brings a lot of problems with it, and we will see that in the coming lectures. But as you can see, most of the nations, to be a nation, they usually hear any or all of the following. You know, they should and have to share a common background, and that can be a language. Language is one of the most, most recognized and promoted one. So, if you are in America, you use English. Your language is English. If you are in France, your mother tongue is French, right? Because every country has its own language, and that language is a very defining characteristics of that nation. Again, ethnic characteristic, historical background, racial thing, they all add up to make a given population a nation. City-state wasn't a nation back in Greece, because we used to call them Athenians. That is, Athenians were only the citizens of Athens. They didn't have the idea of a Greece, big Greece, and being part of Greece. They were Athenians, and Spartans were Spartans. Well, they were both Greek. They were both, belonged to the same, back in 500 BC, they all belonged to the same ethnic characteristic, historical location, but they defined themselves completely different ways, and they got to war with each other, Athenians and Spartans. Well, in today's Greece, you don't see Athenian citizens forming an army and fighting with Spartans, because we have a Greek nation-state formation. Right? And so that's the nation, and that's the state. And state means, again, look at the definition of state: a viable sovereign government exercising authority and power in the name of society in a given territory. Again, we have here a term, sovereignty. It's not a surprise. It's not a coincidence, because I told you earlier that sovereignty is a key concept in explaining the rare privilege that states have, or state does, or has, or possess. Because I said state wouldn't be state if it wasn't sovereign, as you can remember from the last lecture. And so now we have a state and we have a nation. And what happens with this nation-state thing? Why we have the term nation-state? We usually take it for granted, nation-state, because that's the world we're born in. And that's how we get to see the world. We got to see the Germany when we studied geography, when we went to elementary school. We get to study all the countries in the world, and they were all nation-states when we were born. Well, they were nation-states in history, but that's the world we were born into. For instance, just to give you an example, Germany was, before 1861, so that's like almost 150 years, was an amalgamation of different empires and city-states. There was back then Prussia, there was little kingdoms, and Germany became Germany after the unification of all those little principalities, kingdoms, and Prussia. Of course, it was unified under the lead of Prussia, Bismarck, under the military might of Prussia, and that's how we have Germany today, with its borders, with its distinct history, and a group of people. Nation state combines the concept of nation and state, which I explained in detail by giving examples. A nation state basically is an idea and a unit that every nation must have a state, right? That's why we call them nation state. If you look at Eastern Europe, we have Croatia. We have Croatia, which is Croats, yes. We have Serbia, run by Serbs, right? And as you remember, I told you that sometimes this fight over sovereignty in nation states may lead up to conflicts. Well, back in the time before 1990s, of course, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, these countries that we see today, were all Slovakia, were all under the federation called Yugoslavia, Union of Slavs, Yugoslavia, yes, Union of South Slavs. But after the breakup of Yugoslavia, how many nation states come out of it? Many nation states. Back then, of course, again, we had USSR, United Soviet Union, or USSR, Soviet Union. And after its breakup, we had a lot of nation states coming out of it, right? As a nations with a right to have its own sovereignty, with its own territory, with its own borders, and with its own military, and with its own, elected institutions, governments, etc., and etc. So, and that's why we have nation states. Okay. So I hope you get the fact that nation state is a historical phenomenon, and again, it's a combination of two terms, nation and state, that forms the foundation, the logical foundation of today's political world, right? So here is more concepts, more terms. Citizenship, right? Citizenship. I think these are also quite self-explanatory. But citizenship, I want to emphasize membership in a political community such as a country, including rights, duties, and responsibilities. I want you to know that there is no citizenship outside the nation state, because nation state is the political unit of this world. If you do not born into, if you, let's say, born into a US or Germany, you have German nationality, citizenship. German state gives you a citizen, and you are citizen of Germany. So you are citizens of, I don't know, maybe Nigeria. That's all these political units. That's the sovereignty privilege. The nation states is able to give citizenship to its own citizens because it enjoys the privilege of sovereignty over the territory and the society and citizens that lives in it. But luckily, because we have more democratic understanding today, we have citizenship now also includes rights, duties. That is, every citizen enjoys, at least in theory, certain rights, right? In US, in many countries, every citizenship involves certain rights that are not unavoidable and inalienable. And that also comes from, again, American Revolution and French Revolution, but maybe if we have time in the future lectures, we can talk more about that. But at the moment, be aware of the citizenship that nation states grants you a citizenship, and if they don't, then you don't have a nationality and you can't travel. Citizenship is, that's why the nation states are sovereign, right? And of course, we start to have this term authoritarian and democratic. How authoritarian and democratic in the most simpler way is that in democracies we have elections, so your vote counts. In authoritarianism, it doesn't count. Your vote, there's not much vote, yes? Again here, power, more about the power. Yes, rule of law, direct democracy and representative democracy. Now, rule of law is also an important concept of Western democracies. Now, as you can see, we are talking about direct democracy, representative democracy, and rule of law is quite also critical, another concept of Western democracies, or the countries that tries or claims to be democratic anyway. Rule of law, again, here is a fundamental constitutional principle that no government or person is above the law, and that society is governed by laws that apply fairly to all, sometimes to refer to as law and order. Now, rule of law is basically the principle that every citizens are equal in the face of the law. That is, the law is not applied differently to different groups, that everyone, are faced with the law, bound with the law. No group is above the law, okay? These are, again, this is an important concept, rule of law, because that's one of the key principles of Western democracies that came also with American Revolution and also with French Revolution. What did French Revolution do was that it demolished the divine rights of kings in France back then, because back then everyone thought that the political system was that there was a king, emperor, and there was an empire, and then the king had divine rights. He was above the law, what we call autocracy, beyond the law. And French Revolution, what they did, they cut the king's head in the French Revolution. That's why it's a very historic moment. That's why it has a big place in history. And rule of law is that development of Western societies in Europe to regard that every individual is equal in front of the law, and the law is applied to everyone, and no one is above the law, all right? And then here I want to talk briefly about, you can see a direct democracy and representative democracy. Now, we talk a lot about this ancient Greece. We talk about Athens. We talk about polis, city-state. Now, of course, the first experience of democracy happened in ancient Athens. Yes, when the citizens back then had a direct access to participating in the governmental affair. All right, certainly we call this a direct democracy. So, democracy, the birth of democracy, goes back to ancient Greece, to Aristotle's time, to Plato's time. That's why there is this Aristotle defining what politics is, 500 BC, a long time before the Christ was born. But then, back then, in direct democracy of ancient Greece, what was happening is that the governments, we had a government where citizens were directly participating in decisions without representations. Now, of course, in today's world, as I told you, we have a 200 million, 300 million populations, Russia, US, China, billion, India, billion. How are we going to do a direct democracy, right? How are we going to, a billion people will go and try to decide whether, China and US should have a good relations? That would be very difficult, because today's is a world of nation-state world. So today's democracies, Western democracies, are called representative democracies. That's the second one, below the direct democracy. A democracy in which citizens periodically elect others to represent them in the government. That's why it's called representative democracy. You have hundreds of millions of voters, but they vote for a political party or for a person, a president, to represent them in the governments, right? People have the right to vote for others to represent them in institutions, because hundreds of millions of people cannot go to Washington and sit at the Capitol Hall and decide on issues. So that's why we have political parties in Western democracies. We have many different political parties. You vote for one of them to represent you in the National Congress, or for Prime Ministry, or for presidency, right? So I want to direct your attention to the difference between a direct democracy and representative democracy. Direct democracy is not the order of this world. We use only representative democracy. Yes? And before finishing this lecture, I want you to point out the term democracy means. All right? I will come back to it maybe in the coming lectures, but now that we're talking about direct democracy and representative democracy, democracy is a Greek term because it came from ancient Greece, Athens. Demos, krasia. So demos means the populace, the people, and kratos means power, people's power. So if people can elect or directly participate or directly can shape the outcome of events, that means they have power. Again, you have that power terminology, Democracy means people's power, right? People's power to vote, to say something in the affairs of the country that they are living in. That's the terminology, that's the etymology, that is the literal definition of democracy. And I want you to point out that when, of course, democracy for the first time was born in ancient Athens, but I want you to let you know that in ancient Athens, not all citizens could have voted. Women didn't vote. Women were not allowed to vote in ancient Greece, in ancient Athens. Slaves, back then they had slaves. They didn't vote, they couldn't vote. Only property owning males and Athenian citizens could vote in the elections or could participate directly. So of course it's great. Back then, of course, in 500 BC, that was, even though it was only a male, a property-owning male, it was something very extraordinary, given that it was every country was then ruled by emperors who was believed to have a divine rights, and it was very extraordinary to have this city-state Athens, where, okay, a limited amount of population, because women are excluded, women are excluded, slaves are excluded, and non-property owners are excluded, and of course you need to born in Athens and have that Athenian citizenship to vote. So not all the people voted in Athens. Of course it was limited, but again it was a first unique experiment in human history. That's why we have this ancient, that's why democracy comes from there. But of course in today's world, thousands of years have passed, and in today's democracies, although it's representative, women can vote. We don't have any slavery anymore. We abolished it, thank God. And all people can vote and participate in the government without exclusion of any race, gender, belief, and political views, right? So I want to let you know that although democracy was born in Greece, it wasn't a perfect one, right? And I want you to know that what we have today is called a representative democracy, which is different than a direct democracy. And that's the end of the second lecture. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you are getting value of going over the concepts such as nation-state, direct democracy, representative democracy, what does democracy mean, where it comes from, etc. And all these things help you to go over these concepts and see the world in a more sophisticated and a more nuanced way. And I hope it helps you to build up your knowledge for politics. Thank you very much, and have a good day.